Hello children, I welcome you all to our special English hour. Here we learn lots of new things and we have fun while learning these things. Are you ready for some fun? Let's get started. Children, do you like reading books? I'm sure some of you must love reading books. Reading is one of my hobbies. Did you know that there are different genres in books? Yes, just like music has genres, books also has genres and there are many genres in books. जैसे कि हमने पढ़ा था कि संगीत के अलग-अलग प्रकार होते हैं, यानी कि संगीत में जॉनरास होते हैं, उसी तरह किताबों में या कहानियों में भी अलग-अलग प्रकार होते हैं. Let's talk about a few popular genres. Let's start with biographies. Biographies are those stories which people write about famous people. Biography वो genre होता है जिसमें हम हकीकत में रहने वाले लोगों की कहानियां लिखते हैं. For example, you may have read biographies of famous people like Mahatma Gandhi or even Pandit Nehru. So when we read stories of famous people, they are known as biographies. We also have autobiographies. The difference between a biography and an autobiography is that an autobiography is written by the person himself. Autobiography यानी कि आत्मकथा. Autobiography वो होती है जो इंसान अपने बारे में खुद से लिखता है. Now let's move to our next genre. Here we have mystery. This is a very popular genre and it has many types of genres in itself. For example, you may have crime mystery. You may have horror mystery. You may also have psychological mystery. So there are different type of genres in mystery itself. Now let's talk about another very popular genre, and that is science fiction. Science fiction is a genre where you take certain scientifically accurate facts and create a fictional story around it. Science fiction ये तरीका होता है जिसमें हम कोई वैज्ञानिक फैक्ट लेते हैं और उसके इर्द गिर्द एक कहानी बनाते हैं. This genre is very popular both in books and movies. Next, we have fantasy. This is also a very popular genre, and this genre is not just popular amongst children. It is equally popular amongst adults. In this genre, you create a world, and this world may not exist for real. It is imaginary. Sounds amazing, right? So this is my favorite genre, which is fantasy. Today, we are going to read a story. This story is about a detective. Do you know what a detective does? A detective usually solves crime mysteries. Do you know any detective or a character from India? I am not sure if you have heard of him, but this is a very popular character from India. His name was Byomkesh Bakshi. He is known as the Sherlock Holmes of India. Today, we are going to read a story about Sherlock Holmes. Have you heard of Sherlock Holmes? He was a character created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So today, we are going to read a two-part story, and the hero of our story is Sherlock Holmes. If you haven't read a story of Sherlock Holmes, join me. Children, you all know that it is very important for us to learn new words. Only when we learn new words will we be able to learn a language. So now, let's learn some new words. We will see these words in the story when we read it. So I request you to please make a note of these words in your notebooks. Advertisement. 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 I saw an advertisement in the magazine. Seller. 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 The house had a cellar. Diligently. 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 He studied diligently for his exam. Pawnbroker. 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 He collected his watch from the pawnbroker. Representative. 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 She was selected as the class representative. Now, let's read the story from our textbooks. The name of the story is The Red-Headed League. Now, I will be reading this story and I request you to point at the words as I read them. And if you don't have a textbook, listen to me carefully. Part 1. Mr. Wilson's story. When I called upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he was conversing with a visitor who was an elderly man with fiery red hair. Holmes introduced me to the visitor, Mr. Jabez Wilson. He was a pawnbroker. He began by showing us an advertisement in a newspaper. It read as follows: To the Red-Headed League. There is a vacancy for a member of the league. and the salary is £4 a week for nominal services. Red-headed men may apply in person on Monday at 11 o'clock to Duncan Ross at the office of the League, 7 Fleet Street. As I said, this story is being narrated by Sherlock Holmes' friend, Dr. Watson. So here, Dr. Watson says that he entered their house and he saw that Sherlock Holmes was with a visitor. A visitor is a person who comes to our house for a meeting or to talk to us. So there was a visitor and he was talking to Sherlock Holmes. The visitor had red hair. Now, when Sherlock saw that Dr. Watson had entered the room, he asked the visitor to repeat the story that he had just told Sherlock. So, the visitor started by showing an advertisement. Do you remember this word? Yes, it was one of the first words that we learned today. Now, you know what an advertisement is, right? Advertisement is when we try to promote our products or introduce our products to someone. We see advertisements in newspaper or advertisements on our phones, right? So, the man showed an advertisement. The advertisement had appeared in newspaper 2 months ago. Mr. Wilson's assistant, Vincent Spaulding, had shown it to him. Mr. Wilson liked his assistant, Spaulding. He was smart, efficient, and worked for only half the normal wages. But the assistant also had his faults. Every now and then he left work and went down into the cellar to develop photographs. Photography was his hobby. Spaulding showed the advertisement to Mr. Wilson and explained to him that an American millionaire, Mr. Ezekiel Hopkins, had founded the famous Red-Headed League to help all redheads like himself. Spaulding urged Mr. Wilson to apply for the job. So, the two of them went to the address given in the advertisement. Fleet Street was full of red-headed people. Mr. Wilson thought that with so much competition, he would not get the job. He wanted to go back, but Spaulding pushed through the crowd and took Mr. Wilson to the office. There was nothing in the office but a couple of chairs and a table. A red-headed man sat behind the table. He was Mr. Duncan Ross, a representative of Red-Headed League. He was very pleased to see Mr. Wilson and announced immediately that he was well suited for the job. He shook hands with Mr. Wilson congratulated him, and told all other candidates to go back. Mr. Duncan Ross explained that Mr. Wilson would have to be in the office from 10 to 2. If he left the office, he would lose the job. Spaulding assured Mr. Wilson that he would look after Mr. Wilson's business in his absence. The pay was fixed at £4 a week. And the work, said Mr. Wilson, you have to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. The pay was very good, and the work was very light. Mr. Wilson accepted the job and began his work the very next day. Mr. Duncan Ross was there in the office to see that Mr. Wilson did his work properly and did not leave the office. He told Mr. Wilson to start with the letter A. Mr. Wilson wrote diligently for 4 hours without leaving his place. Mr. Ross would drop in from time to time to see that all was right with Mr. Wilson. At 2 o'clock, he bade Mr. Wilson good day and locked the door of the office. Mr. Duncan Ross explains Mr. Wilson everything as to what are his working hours, how much will he be paid, and what is his job. Mr. Wilson had to work from 10 to 2, and he could not leave the office, and if he would get fired. He was going to get paid £4 a week. Do you know what pounds are? Just like we Indians have rupees as our currency, in England they have pounds. So Mr. Wilson was going to get £4 per week. And when asked about what was his work, he had to copy the encyclopedia. So Mr. Wilson started working, and sometimes Mr. Ross would come in to check how Mr. Wilson was working. This went on day after day. Mr. Holmes, said Mr. Wilson, and on Saturday I got my salary. It was the same next week and the same the week after. After a few days, Mr. Duncan Ross came in only once in a while, and after a time he did not come in at all. Mr. Wilson continued. 8 weeks had passed like this, and I had written about abbots, archery, etc., and hoped that I might get on to B soon. And then suddenly the whole business came to an end. Now Mr. Wilson tells Mr. Holmes everything. He tells him that this process of working and getting paid continued for many weeks, until one fine day Mr. Duncan Ross stopped coming, and that happened for 8 straight weeks. Now, Mr. Wilson was very happy with his job because he worked less and he got paid more. But suddenly, one fine day, the entire business closed down. To an end, Holmes asked, "Yes, sir. This morning I went to my work as usual at 10 o'clock. But the door was shut and locked with a little note nailed on it. It said, 'The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9, 1880. I was shocked. I did not know what to do. Mr. Wilson went on with his story. I made enquiries at the nearby offices, but none of them knew anything about the league. The rooms had been rented under a false name. I went home and asked my assistant Spaulding for advice, but he could not help me in any way. I want to find out about the league, Mr. Holmes, who they are and why they played this prank upon me. The whole thing is a mystery. That is why I came to you. I have heard a lot about you." Holmes found Mr. Wilson's story very unusual. He asked, "Mr. Wilson, this assistant of yours who first called your attention to the advertisement, what is he like?" "Small, stout, with no hair on his face. He has a white splash of acid on his forehead." "I thought as much," said Mr. Holmes. "Is he still with you?" "Oh, yes, sir." "That will do, Mr. Wilson. I can give you my opinion on the subject in a day or two. Today is Saturday, and by Monday we may come to a conclusion." Mr. Wilson had told everything to Sherlock Holmes, and now Sherlock Holmes had started thinking. He had a question for Mr. Wilson, and the question was as to how was Mr. Spaulding. Mr. Spaulding was Mr. Wilson's assistant, and Mr. Wilson said that Mr. Spaulding was a short and stout man. He had a mark on his forehead. When Sherlock Holmes hears this, he comes to a conclusion, but he says that he would require 2 days to solve this mystery, and he promises to solve this mystery by Monday. So children, we will come to know what happens after this in our next session. The story is yet to be finished, which we will learn in our next session. So on that note, I would like to take your leave, and I will see you all in our next session. Until then, take care and stay safe. Bye.